Adoptive family tied black woman to a pole and called her worthless, until her billionaire husband, Amara, was 29 years old when the world she lived in finally began to shift. But the seeds of her struggle had been planted much earlier. At just 15, she was adopted into the prestigious Hargrove family, a dynasty whose wealth and influence stretched across boardrooms, charity galas, and political circles. To outsiders, it looked like a fairy tale. An underprivileged girl given a chance to live inside a sprawling mansion, with chandeliers glittering above marble halls and manicured gardens stretching for acres. People assumed she was lucky. What they didn't see were the invisible lines drawn within those walls, lines that marked her as an outsider. From the very beginning, Amara was never embraced as a daughter. She was displayed, introduced at dinners as a blessing the family had taken in, spoken about as though she were a charity project rather than a person. While her adoptive siblings received luxury cars for their birthdays and trips to Europe for the summer, Amara was handed token gifts, cheap jewelry, second-hand items carefully wrapped to appear thoughtful. When family portraits were taken, she was often positioned at the edge, half-shadowed, her presence more symbolic than celebrated. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. Yet despite it all, Amara tried to belong. She kept her head down, followed rules, and convinced herself that if she was obedient enough, loyal enough, maybe one day she would be seen as more than a project. 14 years passed in that silent struggle. She studied hard, worked quietly, and did everything she could to avoid confrontation. Still, the quiet cruelty never stopped. Her adoptive mother's restrained smiles at parties, her father's casual jokes at her expense, and her sister's biting remarks all reminded her that no matter how long she lived there, she would never truly belong. It wasn't just at home where the weight pressed down on her. Beyond the mansion walls, Amara fought another battle. Job interviews that ended with polite rejection letters, opportunities that slipped away with phrases like, "not the right culture fit." She had talent, intelligence, and drive, but doors closed before they could open. And though the rejections were framed in professional language, Amara knew the truth. Bias shadowed her every step. Even her adoptive family played a hand, sometimes discreetly calling employers with subtle warnings that ensured she remained dependent and small. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon, 3 months before the humiliation that would change everything. Amara stepped out of yet another failed interview, her fourth that month. The world outside seemed to mirror her mood: gray skies, slick pavement, and strangers rushing past without notice. She sat on a bench, clutching her bag tightly, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. For a moment, she wondered if the Hargroves had been right all along. If she truly was destined to fail, if all her effort would never amount to anything more than rejection and shame. But fate has a way of placing unlikely encounters at the very moment they're needed most. On that bench, with her spirit heavy and her future uncertain, she met a man who would see what no one else had bothered to notice. He didn't carry the airs of wealth or status, though there was an undeniable steadiness in his presence. His voice was calm, his words simple, but in those first few moments, Amara felt something she had never felt before seen. She didn't know it then, but that chance meeting was the spark of everything that would follow. The job that would finally recognize her value, the love that would shield her from cruelty, and the strength to confront the family that had defined her worth in whispers and humiliation. Still, before all of that unfolded, there was the celebration. A birthday party grand enough to make headlines, hosted on the lush grounds of the Hargrove estate. A night meant to showcase power and wealth, with gowns, tuxedos, and laughter echoing under the stars. For the Hargroves, it was another opportunity to remind the world of their place at the top. For Amara, it would become the stage where years of hidden scars and buried truths erupted into the open. She didn't yet know how everything would unravel, or that her calm defiance would shake the ground beneath the family that had once controlled her life. What she did know was simple: the cracks were widening. And when they finally split apart, nothing. Not the Hargroves' reputation, not their wealth, not their carefully constructed image, would ever be the same again. Amara's life inside the Hargrove mansion continued in carefully hidden misery. To the outside world, she was still part of a privileged family. Guests saw her dressed in elegant gowns during charity galas, smiling for the cameras at events, and walking across the polished marble floors of a home that seemed like a dream. But behind those staged moments, the reality was crushing. Small humiliations piled up like bricks on her chest. At dinner, her opinions were brushed aside as irrelevant. During holidays, she was left out of the family traditions that others enjoyed without question. Her adoptive father's laughter always seemed louder when it came at her expense, and her adoptive mother's silence was just as sharp as any insult. Victoria, her adoptive sister, thrived in cruelty. Each jab, each sly remark, was sharpened by years of superiority. The most painful part wasn't the wealth she lacked compared to them. It was the way they chipped at her spirit, the way they reminded her she was never truly one of them. For years, Amara swallowed it, convincing herself that enduring quietly was strength. But silence has its limits, and the cracks began to show. The struggle outside the mansion was no kinder. Employers whispered polite excuses for rejections, yet she could sense the judgment behind their words. Not a cultural fit, or we'll keep your resume on file, became cruelly familiar. For failed interviews in 1 month left her desperate, but she still carried herself with dignity, even as she walked through the streets with rejection letters clutched in her bag. She didn't know that Margaret, her adoptive mother, had been quietly poisoning her chances by calling employers, planting seeds of doubt about her honesty and character. It was on one of those lowest days that she met Daniel. His approach was simple, almost ordinary. A handkerchief offered, a listening ear, but it was extraordinary to her. For the first time in years, someone listened without judgment, without calculation. Daniel saw her resilience, her sharp mind, her strength hidden beneath exhaustion. Within days, she was brought into Novatech, his company, where everything was different. There, her worth wasn't questioned, it was celebrated. Her ability to analyze, to find patterns in chaos, flourished. For the first time, Amara wasn't someone's project or charity case. She was a vital part of something real. But even as she grew, shadows lingered. The Hargroves weren't just abusive in words. They were relentless in sabotage. They had always depended on her silence, her compliance, her invisibility. Now, something about her changed. She carried herself with quiet confidence. She worked late nights, guarded her phone more carefully, and seemed less afraid of their scorn. They noticed, and their disdain grew sharper. The tension built toward Victoria's 32nd birthday. It was more than just a party. It was a declaration of status, meant to dazzle their social circle. The estate's gardens transformed into a glittering stage of excess, with tables draped in silk, lights strung like stars across the hedges, and music echoing into the night. Guests arrived in sleek cars, draped in jewels and designer gowns. Amara was there too, in a simple light blue dress. She stood among them, but she was never allowed to blend in. And this time, Victoria had devised a cruelty so public, so humiliating, it would be remembered long after the champagne stopped flowing. Under the gaze of dozens of guests, Amara was tied to a decorative post in the garden. Her wrists were dug into by coarse rope, her dress stained by dirt and grass. Laughter erupted, not nervous laughter, but sharp, cutting ridicule. Victoria raised her glass high, her smile glinting in the lights as she announced Amara's failures. The jobs she couldn't keep, the education she never finished, the life that had never measured up. Her father joined in, laughing openly. Her mother's silence masked agreement. And the crowd? They followed, treating her degradation as entertainment. But Amara didn't break. She didn't scream or beg. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes unflinching. The calmness unsettled those watching. Beneath her sleeve, hidden from view, Her smartwatch buzzed softly with a message only she could see. "I'm 5 minutes away. Ready?" The humiliation continued, but Amara's mind was elsewhere. She knew what was coming. She knew the years of documentation, the quiet recordings, the hidden evidence were no longer secrets. Every scar, every cruel message, every lie they had told about her would soon see the light. What the Hargroves believed was their triumph was about to be their undoing. The guests who mocked her would witness a revelation none of them expected. The ropes binding her wrists were temporary, but the truth waiting to break free had the power to bind the Hargroves forever. The laughter grew louder, the champagne poured freely, and Amara stood silently at the center of it all. She had been the family's project, their scapegoat, their target. Tonight, she would become their reckoning. And as the sound of approaching rotors began to faintly tremble through the night sky, no one yet realized the spectacle was about to turn into a scandal that would ripple far beyond the glittering garden. The garden was alive with music, chatter, and cruel laughter, but all of it began to fade as a distant rumble echoed across the night sky. At first, the guests thought it was thunder. They barely glanced upward, too consumed with their glasses of champagne and whispered jokes at Amara's expense. But the low hum grew louder, heavier, until it rattled the decorations strung across the estate. A helicopter, sleek and marked with the Novatech logo, descended onto the nearby field. The downdraft of its blades sent silk tablecloths fluttering and champagne spilling to the ground. Confusion spread among the guests. Eyes turned. Whispers grew louder. Something was happening. And then he appeared. Daniel Lee. Calm, composed, and unmistakably powerful. He strode across the manicured lawn with two figures at his side. Julia Reyes, the journalist renowned for exposing the hidden rot of the elite, and David Lawson, the lawyer whose victories reshaped civil rights cases across the country. Together, they cut through the glittering chaos like a storm through glass. The Hargroves froze. Charles stiffened at the sight of them, Victoria's smug grin faltered, and Margaret's carefully restrained smile collapsed into a nervous twitch. For the first time that evening, the power in the garden shifted. Daniel walked straight to Amara. Without a word, he pulled a small knife from his pocket, cut the ropes binding her, and draped his coat around her shoulders. The crowd, once brimming with laughter, had fallen into stunned silence. Amara's hands trembled as circulation returned, but her face remained calm, her dignity unbroken. Then Daniel spoke, his voice steady but commanding. He introduced himself, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as her husband, the CEO of Novatech, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the world. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a tidal wave. Her husband? Their charity case? Their so-called failure? Victoria let out a brittle laugh, shaking her head in disbelief, while Margaret snapped, insisting it was impossible. But before their denials could gather strength, Julia stepped forward, lifting her press badge. Cameras hidden among the guests were now trained on the Hargroves, broadcasting the entire event. David unfolded court documents, evidence of years of abuse, discrimination, and deliberate sabotage. Then came the strike no one expected. The screens that had been playing Victoria's glossy birthday slideshow suddenly flickered and shifted. One by one, messages appeared. Texts and emails pulled from years of private cruelty. Charles is calling Amara a failed diversity experiment. Margaret wrote to school officials, describing her as unstable and ungrateful. Victoria mocked her as the family servant dressed up as a daughter. The crowd gasped in horror. Friends, business partners, and influencers began slipping away, their carefully painted smiles dissolving into unease. The glittering party had transformed into a public trial. Amara stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but the weight behind it silenced the air. She spoke of 14 years of exclusion, of scars hidden beneath her sleeves, of the humiliations disguised as family jokes. Slowly, she rolled up her sleeve to reveal faint marks, evidence of punishments dismissed as accidents. The crowd stared, horrified, as the truth cut through the night sharper than any blade. Above them, drones hovered, transmitting live to feeds far beyond the Hargrove estate. Every word, every revelation was being watched by thousands, soon millions. The empire the Hargroves had built on power, wealth, and reputation was unraveling in real time. Charles barked out protests, insisting it was all lies. Margaret tried to calm the guests with shaky reassurances. Victoria pleaded that Amara was exaggerating. But their words fell flat. The evidence glowed across the screens, undeniable and damning. For Amara, this was more than revenge. It was reclamation. For years, she had been silent, carrying their cruelty like chains. Tonight, she broke them all. Her voice did not waver as she declared that she was never worthless, never a failure. That the real failure was theirs, in their cruelty, their arrogance, and their blindness. The crowd stood frozen, some horrified, some recording on their phones, some already leaving to avoid association. And through it all, Amara's presence only grew stronger. The Hargroves, once untouchable, now stood stripped of their masks, exposed before the very world they had tried so hard to impress. And just as Amara finished speaking, the cameras zoomed in on her face, her eyes glistening not with defeat, but with power. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the family's project or victim. She was their reckoning. The party that began with humiliation had transformed into something far greater. But what came next, the fallout, the destruction of the Hargroves' empire, and Amara's rise beyond their reach, would prove that this night was not the end. It was only the beginning. By morning, the glitter of Victoria's birthday party was gone, but the consequences remained. What had begun as laughter at Amara's expense had become front-page news across the country. Images of her standing at that pole, bruised but unbroken, spread like wildfire. Headlines didn't call her a victim, they called her a survivor. They called her a symbol of resilience. The Hargroves, once untouchable, began to crumble. Charles was forced to resign from every board position he held after evidence of discrimination surfaced in his companies. Margaret's carefully maintained social circle vanished overnight, friends scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Victoria's career as a glamorous influencer collapsed when sponsors cut ties, and her engagement was called off. Even Peter, the youngest sibling, faced lawsuits for harassment that echoed Amara's own accusations. The family's charity foundation, once celebrated as a beacon of generosity, was exposed for financial fraud and dismantled piece by piece. The mansion itself, once a fortress of exclusion, was sold to cover debts. Its marble halls and glittering chandeliers could no longer hide the truth that had rotted inside for years. And the family who had prided themselves on appearances found themselves stripped bare, their power gone. For Amara, though, this wasn't about revenge. She had carried scars for too long to let her life be defined by what they had done to her. With Daniel's support, she turned pain into purpose. Together, they launched the Foundation for Ethical Adoption, an organization dedicated to protecting children who, like her, had been adopted into homes where love was promised but cruelty was delivered. The foundation provided therapy, legal resources, and advocacy for policy reform. Amara knew what it felt like to grow up in silence, to be told you were a burden instead of a blessing. She swore no other child would feel that same isolation without knowing there was help waiting. Her memoir came a year later. It wasn't written as an expose to sensationalize her trauma, but as a thoughtful exploration of identity, resilience, and belonging. Universities began using her book in social work courses. Survivors of racial injustice and predatory adoptions wrote to her, saying her story gave them language for their own pain. What was once a life hidden in the shadows had become a guiding light for others. But perhaps the most striking moment came when Victoria approached her at a book signing in Los Angeles. Stripped of wealth, stripped of status, she was unrecognizable from the glittering sister who once mocked her. She admitted she did not expect forgiveness, But she had read Amara's words and felt something shift. Amara looked at her, signed a copy, and offered only this. It was never about forgiveness. It's about responsibility. I hope you find peace. I finally found mine. Years passed, and the Hargrove mansion transformed into a youth center for underprivileged children. Its gilded rooms were filled with laughter, learning, and hope, finally serving a purpose worthy of its grandeur. Charles faced a fraud trial. Margaret lived in seclusion. Peter completed court-ordered community service, and Victoria disappeared from the spotlight. The dynasty that once stood as a symbol of privilege became a cautionary tale of cruelty exposed. Amara and Daniel, meanwhile, built a family rooted in love. They adopted 2 children and opened their home to young adults aging out of foster care. Their life was not about glittering appearances, but about building a legacy of compassion and truth. In speeches, Amara often reminded her audiences of one simple truth. Scars do not define you, they guide your strength. And that is the heart of this story. Because Amara's struggle is not hers alone. Across the world, children of color are adopted into families who see them as trophies rather than loved ones. Across industries, countless people still face doors closed with the coded language of culture fit or not the right look. What happened at the Hargrove estate was not just the cruelty of one family. It was a reflection of systemic injustice. So the question lingers. How many Amaras remain unseen? How many voices are silenced? How many stories never told? And what responsibility do we carry, not just to be outraged when injustice is exposed, but to build systems where dignity and belonging are never optional? Amara's story proves that humiliation can become hope, that cruelty can ignite change, and that silence can transform into a voice strong enough to shake entire empires. And as you listen now, ask yourself, if pain can be turned into power, what could change if we all refuse to be silent? Amara's journey is a reminder of how resilience can turn pain into power and expose the truth hidden behind wealth and privilege. What part of her story struck you the most? The cruelty she endured, or the strength she found to rise above it? Share your thoughts in the comments because your voice matters here. And if stories like this move you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep shining a light on powerful stories that deserve to be heard.